Hi, everybody. So today what we're going to speak about is the metaphor of a tree, which you can see behind me, as an essential way of speaking about the aspects of an authentic Catholic contemplative spiritual life. This is a way of integrating various aspects of the contemplative tradition that is found both east and west. And it's also a way of ensuring that we don't fall off into modern errors that are made in various things like the New Age movement and, things that have been influenced by that. This is a way of really kind of showing how a lot of things fit together. And if we have this understanding of these 5 principles, we will be able to much better deal with our interior experiences. And so I want to begin by understanding that this is like a tree. So there are essentially five things that make this kind of operate kind of like a cross. There are 5 things that make this function in that kind of a way. So what I want to focus on here is how when you think about these things, they will enable you to understand the facets of your interior experience. And at the root of this is the experience of the sacraments. That is the most important thing, which is participation in the sacraments. And that is our orientation, toward the sacramental experiences of our life, that for those aspects of the experience, that's the root of this tree, is participation in the sacraments. The next thing that's important, and you'll notice that all these begin with a P. We have participation in the sacrament is the root, and then prayer is the second thing. And prayer involves an expression of our misery toward God, of our need toward God. It is a self-expression, and that is also essential to the interior life and the interior experience. The next thing that is important, because you see, what is happening is that prayer, before we go on to the next thing, prayer is a way of relating as a conscious person, using the conscious part of our mind, to what is, we could say, if we were to use a kind of psychological language in the spiritual life, to what is superconscious, that which is God, that which is beyond our limited personhood, and that which is, God. So you can use that term superconscious in this sense, that we are using psychological language about the spiritual life. So the orientation of our conscious mind toward that which is superconscious is prayer. The orientation of our conscious mind, similarly, toward that which is sacramental is participation. So those were the 2 that we kind of went through. The root is the conscious will participate in the sacrament, and the conscious will pray to the superconscious. So that is the roots. The trunk of the root. So the trunk is prayer, the root is the sacraments. And there are some different branches here. To one side, we have the relationship of the conscious to other people. The relationship of the conscious Or actually, I should phrase this. So we have the relationship of the conscious to other people, other consciousnesses, the relationship of the conscious to itself, and the relationship of the conscious to the subconscious. These kind of make the form of a cross. So it's prayer, it's participation in the sacraments, prayer, peacemaking and peaceable actions with others. On the other side, we have practicing the virtues. And then we have having perspective on what is unconscious. And I'm going to explain these now in more detail. We'll begin actually with perspective on what is unconscious, because this is a part that is neglected often in the spiritual life in the West, one of the rules given by Saint Romuald in the West does make mention of this. He describes sitting in one's cell and essentially looking at and kind of like a fisherman looking at one's thoughts. And this is something that is much more familiar in the kind of New Age or pop spirituality settings as mindfulness or the awareness of thoughts. But it seems to be present in the tradition of the Eastern Christian spirituality, which involves a kind of, which has more of a sense of observation of thought, more of a distance from thought. And you could hear this in the phrase, I believe it's from the Philokalia, which is to survey the thoughts, is to calm them. And so this is essentially the idea of perspective. How does the conscious mind relate to the unconscious or relate to the various movements? It relates to it with awareness. It relates to it by observation, detachment, and distance, so that there's not a sense that you are caught in the stream of consciousness. And this is obviously, can be abused, in the sense of thinking we are the true self and we are not at all anything that's in our mind. But there needs to be some distance. Of course, there is an error of a complete detachment, which is the error of completely the Eastern mysticism, from Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism, so on and so forth. But there is a truth that we can observe our thoughts. And so this is very important, because if we don't have this, our mental life is beset by constant impingements, and so there's no distance between us. It's like doing an operation with no gloves. It's like, it's like it's driving down the street with no windshield. So that's the problem. So there needs to be that barrier, and so that is that thing of perspective on the unconscious. So the other things that have to happen are peacemaking or peaceable behavior, toward other people. We could, if we want to, reach out to others with the peace of God, with the love of God, the mercy of God, which He brings into our lives. Christ has made peace between the Father through, everything that He's done for us in His atoning work. We want to extend that to others through merciful actions. And so that's another thing we have to do to other consciousnesses. We must extend that mercy. And then there is the relation of the consciousness to itself, and consciousness to itself is going to be working on the practice of the virtues. It's kind of a different, and it's not exactly self-improvement, it is practice. It is not that you say, okay, I now obtain, you're not thinking about obtaining the virtue, you're thinking about practicing the virtue. But it's similar to self-improvement, but it's not exactly, it's practice. It brings it to that immediacy and, that reality of the present moment. And so that is a description of the interior life. I believe that's an authentic way of kind of giving a psychological description of the interior life. And this can be done through this thing. So if I'm now going to rephrase it. So this is about how to appropriately be operate the conscious part of your mind. To be truly and authentically in the conscious part of your mind in a Catholic tradition. You begin, the root of this is your participation in the sacraments. The trunk of this is prayer. The branches include perspective on the unconscious. Your consciousness has perspective on the unconscious. Toward other selves, other consciousnesses, it has this peaceable behavior, this peacemaking behavior. Toward itself, it has the practice of virtue. And so those are the different ways of thinking about this tree of the interior life. And I hope this is helpful to you in understanding a model of interior life that is kind of integrates what has been said in the like kind of the Eastern Orthodox or Eastern Catholic East and the Catholic West, and kind of gives a psychological model that overlaps and gives a different type of language to that territory. And this is the bonus part of this video, because most people can just stop it right here because we have the beautiful analogy of the tree, but I'm going to ruin it by giving you a little bit too much information. This last piece of information is, I think, a way of really understanding the different types of ways that this type of the soul has been described. And it kind of gives us that some more, it relates this idea of consciousness, the conscious part of our mind, to what has been said about it in other traditions. So this is kind of just a footnote to this video, but I'm just going to include it here in case anyone's interested. The conscious part of our mind is, I believe, what St. Francis de Sales talked about as the superior part of our soul. The subconscious would be somewhat at least overlapping with what is the inferior part of the soul, the various movements, the various thoughts that go through it. So that is something that I think is a pretty clear analogy there. Obviously, when Saint Teresa of Avila speaks about the interior prayer and realizing that God is at the center of one's soul, she's talking about what I'm saying here as the superconscious, or when the Eastern fathers describe the created light. I believe they're speaking about the awareness of our soul's capacity for awareness and consciousness. And I believe that the love of God is what they describe as the uncreated light, again from that superconscious place. I'm linking these traditional terms to what is in this model. Again, I mentioned some different phrasing of things like from, I believe from the Philokalia or St. Romuald. I mentioned those earlier in the video. But I want to also say this, when we're talking about the conscious part of our mind, the superior part of our soul, how do we kind of talk about this? Well, a lot of times in the West, this can be spoken about as the intellect and the will. And in the East, there's this mentioning of the spiritual heart. And those terms don't all sound like the same thing, but they kind of do the same stuff. So I wanted to say, in this model, you actually have a way of kind of integrating these things, because you realize that these are different descriptions of the same territory, which is our conscious mind, this unified personality. Because with respect to the capacity for prayer, we can describe the conscious part of ourself as the spiritual heart, or the nous, as they describe it in the Eastern Fathers. With respect to the capacity of awareness and knowing, we could call it, that practice of perspective, we could call it the intellect, this knowing faculty. And with respect to the efforts it makes in the practice of virtue, we could call it the will. And, in respect to others, we could call it the soul, or we could call it a person, or, so there's all these different ways in which we can, those are all different ways in which we can kind of think about this. So there's a lot of different ways in which we can, we can describe it also and relate. We can describe it as the image of God in ourselves, and so on and so forth. So there's lots of ways we can describe this conscious part of the self, and that's kind of this bonus part of the video. But the main thing I wanted to highlight were those 5 different things that are essential to the interior life, and that kind of let us kind of have a model for working with ourselves and our interior growth.